She had 30 seconds to make a decision, and she made the wrong one. A billionaire CEO stood at the top of her private jet stairs, looked down at a man in a worn work jacket and old boots, and said 4 words that would bring her entire company to its knees. "Get off my plane." He didn't argue. He didn't beg. He simply picked up his daughter's backpack and walked away. And the moment he did, $60 million in aircraft, in technology, in her future, went completely, catastrophically dark. Here's what she didn't know. That quiet, tired man had built the very system keeping her jet in the air. If you believe that dignity cannot be bought, stripped, or silenced, hit that subscribe button right now and follow this story all the way to the end. I promise you, it will stay with you long after it's over. And while you're here, drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The call came at 4:17 in the morning. Nathan Drake was already awake, had been awake since 2. Sitting in the narrow kitchen of his apartment with a cold cup of coffee and a stack of maintenance manuals he'd been trying to concentrate on for the past hour without much success. The phone buzzed against the laminate tabletop, and when he saw the number, his stomach dropped before he even answered. It was Dr. Reyes, the surgeon. "Mr. Drake." Her voice was professional, measured, the tone doctors learn to use when they've rehearsed bad news enough times that it no longer shakes them. "Lily's pre-op labs came back this morning. We need to move the procedure up. We're scheduling for 8 a.m. We'd like you here before she goes under, if at all possible." Nathan didn't remember what he said after that. He thought it was something like, "Of course," or "I'll be there." Some automatic human response his mouth produced while his brain simply stopped processing. He hung up, looked at the cold coffee, looked at the clock on the microwave. 4:19 now, and did the math with the sick mechanical precision of a man who had spent his adult life solving problems he hadn't caused. 8 a.m. surgery, San Francisco. He was in Portland. The first available commercial flight left at 5:45 and landed at 7:20, which gave him maybe 40 minutes of margin if traffic cooperated, and traffic in San Francisco in the morning never cooperated. He booked the ticket on his phone with hands that weren't entirely steady, grabbed the bag he kept packed for hospital visits, a habit he'd developed 3 months ago when Lily was first diagnosed, and was out the door in under 12 minutes. The bag was hers, technically. A faded blue backpack with a small iron-on patch of a cartoon airplane on the front pocket, the kind of thing an 8-year-old picks out herself and is deeply serious about. Lily had pressed it into his hands on his last visit and told him, with the grave authority of a child who had spent too much time in medical waiting rooms, that he needed to carry something that was hers when they couldn't be together. "So you remember what you're coming to, Dad?" He'd laughed at the time. Now he held the backpack against his chest in the back of a ride share at 4:45 in the morning and didn't feel like laughing about anything. The driver tried to make conversation. Nathan responded in monosyllables until the man got the message. Portland International was quiet in the way airports are quiet before dawn. Not peaceful, just emptied out, the bones of the place visible without the crowds to fill it in. Nathan got through security in 15 minutes, found his gate, and sat down in one of those aggressively uncomfortable plastic chairs with the backpack on his lap and his phone in his hand, watching the departure board. 5:45 a.m. to San Francisco. On time. He watched it for 11 minutes. Then the status changed. Cancelled. No explanation on the board. He went to the desk. The gate agent, a young woman with the particular exhausted patience of someone 3 hours into a shift that wasn't supposed to be hers, explained that a mechanical issue had grounded the aircraft and that they were working to rebook all passengers on the next available flight. "When's the next flight?" Nathan asked. "We have availability at 9:45. "That's too late," he said. It came out quieter than he intended. Not aggressive, just flat. Final. "My daughter goes into surgery at 8. I need to be there." The gate agent looked at him with genuine sympathy, which was somehow worse than indifference would have been. "I'm so sorry, sir. I can put you on the priority standby list for the 7:15, but it's showing full right now." "Is there anything at a different terminal? Another airline?" She typed. Frowned. Typed again. "The earliest I'm seeing from any carrier is 8:10, and that one has a connection in—" "Okay." Nathan stepped back from the desk. "Thank you." He stood in the middle of the terminal for a moment, completely still. The kind of stillness that comes not from calm, but from a man holding a very large weight and deciding where to set it down. Then he picked up his phone and started thinking like an engineer, which meant he started looking at the problem differently. He walked the terminal, gate by gate. He was looking for something specific, not a ticket counter, not a departure board. He was looking for ground crew, the maintenance workers who moved around the edges of airports at hours like this, the ones in the orange vests with the grease on their knuckles. He'd been one of them, once, in a different life. He still knew how to find them. He found two of them near Gate 14, standing beside a fuel cart and having the low-voiced, irritated conversation of people trying to diagnose something that wasn't cooperating. Nathan slowed down as he passed. Not because he meant to interfere, more the way a carpenter automatically reads a joint when he walks past woodworking, the professional reflex that never quite turns off. He heard one of them say something about a pressure anomaly. He heard the other one say hydraulics, and then intermittent fault, and then system won't isolate the signal. Nathan stopped. He turned around. "Sorry," he said. I was just passing by. What system is throwing the fault?" The two men looked at him. The older one, a heavy-set guy in his 50s with a gray mustache and a name tag that said Ray, looked him up and down, the worn jacket, the battered boots, the child's backpack, and did the mental calculation that most people do automatically. "We're handling it," Ray said. "Not rude, just conclusive." "Yeah, I know. Nathan pointed at the panel they had open. "That's a 400 series environmental control interface, right? The blue connector housing? I've seen that fault code before. Usually the signal's not actually coming from hydraulics. It originates in the auxiliary power monitoring loop, and the diagnostic software misclassifies it. If you check the APU connection at junction 7, you'll probably find a loose ground." Silence. Ray looked at his younger colleague. His younger colleague looked at the panel. "How do you know that?" Ray asked. "I designed avionics systems for 8 years, Nathan said simply, before I didn't anymore." Another silence. Ray scratched the back of his neck. Then, almost reluctantly, he pulled out his diagnostic tablet and navigated to the APU junction readouts. The number that came back made him go still. "Junction 7, the younger mechanic said quietly. "Bad ground." Ray looked at Nathan for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, slowly, the way men of his generation acknowledge things they don't want to make a big production of. "Where are you trying to get to?" "San Francisco, by 8. Ray pulled out his phone. "What's What happened next was not something Nathan fully understood until later. Ray, it turned out, knew a ramp supervisor named Frank, who knew a private aviation coordinator named Diane, who was currently coordinating the turnaround of a private aircraft in the executive terminal on the south end of the airport. The aircraft had been held briefly for a system check, was now cleared, and had, according to Diane, one seat that wasn't occupied, belonging to a passenger who had canceled 20 minutes ago. "It's a Sterling aviation bird," Ray told him, his hand over the phone. "You know Sterling?" "I know of them," Nathan said carefully. "The owner's aboard. Big shot CEO, some kind of business deal in San Francisco this morning. Their wheels up in 40 minutes. Ray gave him a look. "Diane says if you can get to the executive terminal in the next 15 minutes, they'll clear you through as a technical placement. Maintenance consultant boarding for positioning purposes. It's not exactly standard." "I understand," Nathan said. "And I'll be there in 10. He held out his hand. Ray shook it. "Good luck with your girl," Ray said. Nathan was already walking. The executive terminal was a different world from the main building. Quieter, carpeted, with leather chairs and a coffee bar that was actually staffed at this hour. Nathan presented himself at the desk, gave his name, and was processed through by a woman named Diane, who looked at his jacket and his backpack the way people look at a word they can't quite place, and then handed him a boarding pass without comment. He was walked across the tarmac by a ground crew member, the cold pre-dawn air cutting through his jacket, and he climbed the stairs of the aircraft with the specific mental focus of a man who has narrowed his entire world down to one number. 7:20. He needed to land by 7:20. The aircraft was a Meridian G7 long-range executive jet, and even exhausted, even terrified about his daughter, Nathan noticed the modifications immediately. There were things about this aircraft that were different from the production model. Subtle things. The kind of changes only someone who had spent years thinking about flight systems would catch. A different antenna cluster near the forward fuselage, a modified access panel near the main avionics bay that wasn't standard issue. The exterior paint was perfect, the engines were whisper quiet on idle, and the overall condition was immaculate in the way that only serious money can maintain. He found his seat, stowed the backpack in the overhead, and sat down. Pressed his palms flat against his thighs. Closed his eyes. Breathed. She'll be okay? She will be okay? You'll be there. He didn't open his eyes again until he heard voices near the front of the aircraft. Victoria Sterling did not walk into rooms. She arrived in them. Nathan had seen pictures. She was the kind of executive who made business press. The 30-year-old who had taken a mid-tier regional aviation company and turned it into a $60 million operation inside of 5 years through a combination of aggressive acquisition strategy, engineering investment, and a personal reputation for not tolerating anything she considered beneath her standards. In photographs, she always looked composed, precise, like someone who had pre-calculated the exact impression she intended to make and executed it without deviation. In person, she looked tired. Not visibly. She would never allow that. But Nathan had spent enough time around people under pressure to recognize the particular quality of someone holding a controlled tension behind their eyes. She was in a charcoal blazer and dark trousers, hair pulled back, phone already in hand, moving through the cabin with the efficient speed of someone who had learned to extract exactly what they needed from any space and discard the rest. Behind her came a man Nathan clocked immediately and instinctively without entirely knowing why. Tall, mid-40s, with a specific kind of polish that certain men in expensive suits achieve, the kind that has no rough edges visible anywhere. His name, Nathan would learn later, was Marcus Hale, and he was Victoria Sterling's chief strategic officer, her closest advisor, the architect of her deal-making. He moved like a man who was comfortable in his position because he had spent years making sure it was unassailable. He was also, Nathan noticed, watching everything in the cabin with the quality of attention that wasn't quite relaxed. Victoria was speaking to one of the flight attendants near the forward galley. The attendant nodded, said something about departure in 30 minutes, offered coffee. Victoria accepted. Then her eyes moved through the cabin in the efficient inventory sweep of someone who owned the space, and she stopped. She was looking at Nathan. He met her eyes, gave her a small, neutral nod, the kind of nod you give to a stranger on an airplane. She did not nod back. He saw the assessment happen in real time, the jacket, the boots, the worn backpack in the overhead, the fact that he looked like he'd driven to the airport rather than been chauffeured. He watched her glance at Marcus Hale. He watched Hale's eyes settle on him and sharpen slightly, like a man adjusting a lens. Nathan looked back down at the backpack on his lap. He'd taken it out of the overhead, he needed it close, and waited. He didn't have to wait long. The flight attendant appeared at his shoulder, young, professional, with the uncomfortable expression of someone delivering a message she hadn't written. "Sir, I'm sorry to bother you. Could you tell me your name and the purpose of your boarding today?" "Nathan Drake," he said. "I was cleared through the executive terminal as a technical placement, maintenance consultant, positioning." She smiled the apologetic smile. "Of course. I'll just... One moment." She went forward. There was a conversation at the front of the aircraft that Nathan couldn't hear but could read in its general outlines from the body language. Hale spoke more than Victoria did. At one point, he gestured briefly toward the back of the cabin, toward Nathan, with the precise economy of a man who expected gestures to be sufficient. The flight attendant came back. This time, Victoria Sterling came with her. She stopped at Nathan's row. Up close, she was composed and direct, and looked at him the way people look at problems they intend to resolve efficiently. "Mr. Drake," she said. Her voice was even, not unkind, but with the quality of someone who had already made a decision and was informing him of it rather than discussing it. "I apologize for any confusion with the boarding process. I'm not sure exactly how the mix-up occurred, but this is a private aircraft and it isn't available for general passenger placement." "I understand that," Nathan said. "Diane Marsh in the executive terminal coordinated the boarding through your ramp operations team. I can give you the authorization reference." "I'm sure there was some kind of miscommunication," Hale said from 2 steps behind Victoria. His tone was smooth, friendly almost. "These things happen. The executive terminal processes a lot of requests." Nathan looked at Hale for just a moment. Then back at Victoria. My daughter has surgery at 8 a.m. in San Francisco, he said. Not as a plea, just as a fact. I need to be there before she goes under. This was the only option I had. Something moved across Victoria's face. It wasn't quite guilt, and it wasn't quite discomfort. It was the expression of someone who wasn't heartless, but who had trained herself to make decisions without letting sentiment complicate the analysis. Her eyes flicked to the backpack in his hands, the child's backpack, the cartoon airplane on the pocket, and then back to his face. I'm sorry, she said, and he thought she meant it. I genuinely am, but I can't have unauthorized passengers on this aircraft, for liability reasons, for security reasons. I hope you understand. Of course, Nathan said. He stood up. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice or make a speech or give her the wounded look that might have made her feel bad about it. He simply picked up the blue backpack, tucked it under his arm, and moved past her down the aisle toward the exit. What he didn't do, couldn't do, wouldn't have thought to do, was tell her his full name. Not just Nathan Drake, the maintenance consultant placement, but Nathan Drake, the systems engineer who, 6 years ago, in a different life, had sat at a drafting table and designed from the ground up the proprietary flight safety architecture that was currently running in the avionics bay of this specific aircraft. He walked down the stairs and back onto the tarmac. The pre-dawn air hit him like a wall. He stood for a moment on the concrete, looking at nothing, holding his daughter's backpack, and let himself feel the full weight of where he was. No flight, no backup plan. Surgery in less than 3 hours in a city 400 miles away. The sky to the east had just started to lighten. That thin gray-blue line that comes before sunrise, the part of the sky that doesn't commit to anything yet. He pulled out his phone to start looking at alternatives. Rental car maybe, private car service. Whether there was any charter option left at this hour that he hadn't. His phone buzzed. It was Dr. Reyes's office number. He answered. Mr. Drake? Not the doctor this time, an administrative assistant. I just wanted to let you know that Lily is asking for you. She's been asking for about 20 minutes. If there's any way to give us an updated ETA, tell her I'm on my way, Nathan said. Tell her I will be there. He hung up, put the phone in his pocket, and then he stood there for 32 more seconds, because 32 seconds was all he was going to allow himself, and then he was going to figure out the next move. Except that 32 seconds wasn't necessary, because behind him, from the top of the jet stairs, he heard a sound he recognized immediately and instinctively. The sound of an entire avionics system shutting down. Not a normal power cycle, not a controlled shutdown. The specific, complete, total silence of a flight management system that had lost its mind. Every light in the cockpit windows went dark. Then a sound he'd never expected to hear again in his life. A series of tones, 3 ascending notes and 1 low sustained tone, that he recognized because he had programmed them himself. An audio signature he had embedded in the Guardian flight system as an identification protocol. A sound that meant, in the language he had written into the software 7 years ago, unauthorized departure sequence detected, architect authentication required. Nathan Drake stood on the cold tarmac with his daughter's backpack under his arm and listened to his own creation refuse to fly. He closed his eyes. Of course, he thought. Of course. Then he opened them, looked back up at the aircraft, and started walking toward the stairs. Behind him, on the tarmac, a ground crew member had already gotten on his radio. Inside the cockpit, both pilots were staring at screens that showed nothing but a single text prompt in clean white letters against a black display. Guardian Flight System V.4. Architect Authentication Required System, Locked Pending Identity Verification. Unauthorized Departure Sequence, Blocked. Upstairs, in the main cabin, Marcus Hale had gone very still in his seat, and Victoria Sterling stood at the top of the aircraft stairs, looking down at the man she had just dismissed, watching him walk back toward her with a steady, unhurried step, and felt the first cold touch of something she didn't yet have a name for. She would have a name for it before the morning was over. It was called Reckoning. The stairs hadn't been retracted yet. That was the only reason the ground crew chief, a barrel-chested man named Lou, who had been working the executive ramp for 19 years, didn't have to chase Nathan Drake down across the tarmac. Lou was already on his radio when Nathan turned around, already talking to the cockpit crew, already getting the particular clipped non-answers that pilots give when something has gone wrong that they don't fully understand yet. He watched Nathan walk back toward the aircraft with the calm, purposeful stride of someone who wasn't returning out of anger or wounded pride, but out of something more practical than either. And Lou stepped aside because something in the man's bearing made stepping aside seem like the correct decision. Nathan climbed the stairs without being invited. Victoria Sterling was still standing at the top of them. She had not moved since the lights went out. Not from paralysis, Victoria didn't do paralysis, but from the specific stillness of someone rapidly recalculating. Her phone was already in her hand. Behind her in the cabin, she could hear Marcus Hale making calls in a low, controlled voice, and one of her legal staff had appeared from the rear seats and was asking questions that nobody was answering yet. The two pilots had come out of the cockpit and were standing in the forward galley looking at each other with the careful expressions of professionals who were out of their depth and knew it. When Nathan reached the top step, Victoria didn't move out of his way immediately. She looked at him, really looked at him this time. Not the inventory assessment from before, but something more direct, more uncertain. "Mr. Drake," she said, "what just happened to my aircraft?" "Your aircraft is fine," Nathan said. "Your aircraft did exactly what it was built to do." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It's not." He glanced past her into the cockpit, where the screens were still dark except for that single white text prompt. "Can I get in there?" She didn't move. "I need to understand what's happening before I let anyone touch those controls." "I understand that, but you've got about 20 minutes before your ground crew starts making calls that turn this into an airport authority situation. And once that happens, you're not going anywhere this morning and your acquisition meeting is finished." He said it without any pleasure, just the shape of the problem, clearly laid out. "Or you can let me sit down at that panel for 5 minutes and I'll tell you everything." A beat. Victoria Sterling had not gotten where she was by being slow, and whatever she'd expected from the man in the worn jacket, it wasn't this. The quiet certainty, the total absence of performance, the way he talked about her aircraft like someone who had opinions about it that predated her ownership. She stepped aside. Nathan walked into the cockpit. The captain, a silver-haired man named Graves, who had been flying private jets for 22 years, looked at Nathan with undisguised suspicion. "Who are you?" "Nathan Drake." He crouched in front of the center console, looking at the dark screens. "Who certified this aircraft's flight management system?" "Sterling Aviation's Internal Engineering Division," Graves said. "Right. Who certified it before that?" A pause. "The original system was contracted through a third-party developer, about 6-7 years ago, before my time." Nathan nodded slowly, looking at the text prompt. "Guardian Flight System V.4, Architect Authentication Required." He hadn't seen those words on a screen in 6 years, hadn't expected to see them again. The strange thing was that he didn't feel vindicated or angry or even particularly surprised. He mostly just felt tired and underneath the tiredness, worried about Lily. "This system was mine," he said. Not loudly, not with any drama attached to it, just a statement of fact delivered to the cockpit wall. "I designed it. I wrote the core architecture. The authentication lock is a failsafe I built in. It was never supposed to be necessary. It activates if the system detects an unauthorized departure sequence. Something triggered it." He stood up, turned to Graves. "Has anyone run a non-standard command through the flight management interface in the last hour? Anything that deviated from normal pre-departure protocol?" Graves exchanged a look with his first officer, a younger woman named Chen who had been very quiet and very attentive since the screens went dark. "There was a pre-positioning command entered about 40 minutes ago," Chen said carefully. "It came through as an automated routing update. I thought it was from dispatch." "What did it change?" "The arrival airport designation," she said, "originally filed for SFO. The update changed it to a private strip, designation RVK4. Nathan was quiet for a moment. "Did you override it?" "I flagged it as unusual, but the system accepted it as valid, and the authorization code that came with it matched our dispatch protocol format." Chen's voice had taken on the very controlled quality of a professional who was starting to understand that something had been done to her aircraft and was working very hard to remain precise. "I put a query into dispatch but hadn't heard back yet." "RVK4, Nathan said. He turned that over. "That's not a commercial strip." "No," Chen said. "It's private. I looked it up when the flag came through. About 60 miles northeast of San Francisco, owned by a holding company. The cockpit had gone very quiet. Nathan became aware that Victoria Sterling was standing in the doorway behind him. He didn't turn around yet. The authentication lock, he said, mostly to himself, working through it aloud, would have triggered the moment the system calculated a departure toward RVK4 and cross-referenced it against the filed flight plan. The Guardian system was built to prevent exactly this, automated or unauthorized route changes that pilots hadn't explicitly sanctioned. If someone loaded a redirect into the flight management computer and it didn't match the authorized plan, the system locks departure until the original architect resets the security layer. He paused. Someone changed your destination without your pilots knowing. The system caught it and shut everything down. The silence that followed was not comfortable. He turned around then and looked at Victoria. Her face was very composed and very still, and he had the impression of a person standing in a wind they hadn't seen coming, holding their footing through sheer force of will. "Who has access to your dispatch authorization codes?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes moved past him, very briefly, toward something or someone in the cabin behind her. Then they came back to Nathan. "A small number of people," she said. "You need to narrow that list down," Nathan said. "But first, do you want to get to San Francisco or not? Because I can reset the authentication layer, get your screens back, and clear the aircraft for departure. But I need to know two things. First, that the corrupted route data gets pulled from the system entirely, not just overwritten. And second," he hesitated, not for effect, because what he was about to say was going to be strange, and he knew it. "I need your chief strategy officer to stay away from every flight system on this aircraft for the duration of the flight." Victoria's eyes sharpened. "Marcus." "I'm not accusing him of anything," Nathan said immediately. "I'm telling you what I need in order to do this. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong, and you can have that conversation with me when we land." "That's a significant thing to ask." "Yes," he agreed. "It is." She looked at him for what felt like a long time, but was probably 8 seconds. Then she said, "Fix my aircraft, Mr. Drake." He turned back to the cockpit. What happened next took 11 minutes, not 5, because the authentication reset wasn't simple, so it had never been designed to be simple, because a safety lock that could be bypassed quickly was a safety lock that wasn't worth having. Nathan worked from memory, from the structure of something he had built so thoroughly into his understanding that he could navigate it the way other people navigate their own houses in the dark. And Graves and Chen watched him with the focused, professional attention of pilots, observing something outside their expertise, but within their responsibility to monitor. He didn't explain everything as he worked. He explained enough. He told them what each step was doing in plain language, not because they asked, but because he had always believed, it was one of the things that had eventually gotten him in trouble, that the people responsible for flying an aircraft had the right to understand everything happening inside it. At one point, Chen said quietly, "You know this system better than our technical manual does." "That's because our technical manual is wrong in a few places," Nathan said, not looking up. "The pressure differential calculation in Section 9 is off by a factor of about 1.3. It's been wrong since the third version. Nobody caught it because nobody read it carefully enough." Chen made a sound that might have been a short, involuntary laugh. "I flagged that calculation 6 months ago. My maintenance report came back saying it was within acceptable parameters." Nathan stopped what he was doing, looked up at her. "You put that in writing?" "I put everything in writing," she said simply. He held her gaze for a moment. "Good. Keep doing that." Then he went back to work. When the screens came up, all of them, cleanly, simultaneously, the full array of navigation and flight management displays restoring to their normal state, Graves let out a breath that he'd clearly been holding for a while. Chen immediately began running through her instrument checks with the speed of someone who'd been waiting to do exactly that. Nathan stepped back, away from the controls, which was important to him. He hadn't touched anything that wasn't his to touch, had only interacted with the security architecture layer, the part that was genuinely and originally his. "You'll want to pull the route data log and quarantine the automated update that came through 40 minutes ago," he told them. "Don't delete it. You'll need it." "For what?" Graves asked. Nathan picked up the cartoon airplane backpack from where he'd set it beside the cockpit door. "Whoever sent that route change didn't expect the system to catch it, which means they expected this flight to go somewhere it wasn't supposed to go, and nobody would know until it was too late." He looked at Graves steadily. That log is going to matter to a lot of people. He walked back into the cabin. Marcus Hale was seated near the front, and Nathan felt the man's eyes on him from the moment he came through the cockpit door. Hale had a very particular expression, pleasant, engaged, the expression of a man who had sat across from difficult situations in boardrooms and learned to look like the most reasonable person in the room at all times. He was good at it. Nathan had met people like him before. He had, in a certain sense, been destroyed by people like him before. All sorted out? Hale said pleasantly. Getting there, Nathan said. He found his original seat, sat down, and put the backpack on his lap. His hands were steady. He was aware of his heart rate in a way he usually wasn't, the particular elevated awareness that came from operating under too much pressure for too many hours. He checked his phone. 6:48 a.m. If they left in the next 20 minutes, he could still make it. Victoria appeared from the forward galley, coffee cup in hand, and sat down across the aisle from him. Not next to him, not at the formal distance she'd maintained earlier. The middle distance of someone who was revising their assessment and hadn't finished yet. "You said the system was yours," she said. Quietly, so the conversation stayed between them. "Yes." Guardian Flight System. Version 4, yes. I built versions 1 through 4. I was let go before version 5 went into production. He said it flatly, without the bitterness that would have been understandable, because he had a long time ago decided that carrying bitterness around required energy he needed for other things. Victoria wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. Sterling Aviation acquired the Guardian system as part of a technology portfolio purchase 4 years ago. The documentation that came with it listed the originating developer as a company called Apex Integrated Systems. Apex Integrated was the corporate shell, Nathan said. The engineers who actually built it. I was the lead architect. My name was in every design document until about 3 months before I was let go. Then it wasn't anymore. She looked at him carefully. What happened? He was quiet for a moment. Outside the small oval window, the sky had moved from gray-blue to something closer to pale gold. In another hour, it was going to be a clear, bright morning, the kind of morning that felt indifferent to whatever was happening on the ground. I was told that a safety feature I'd built in was causing operational delays, he said. The pilot authority override, so the core of the Guardian concept, the thing that made it different from every other flight management system on the market. It gave pilots a hard lock on automation commands. No automated system could override a pilot's manual input, not under any circumstances. The engineers above me said it was too restrictive, that it was slowing down departure sequences on certain aircraft configurations. He paused. I said I wouldn't remove it. We argued about it for about 4 months. Then they removed it without me, brought in a contractor to rework that section of the code, and 3 months later they told me my position had been eliminated. Victoria's hands tightened slightly around the cup. 2 years after that, Nathan continued, a Guardian-equipped aircraft experienced an automated guidance conflict during approach. The automation tried to correct for a sensor error. The pilots tried to override it. The system, the modified system, the version they'd reworked, prioritized the automated command. He stopped, looked out the window. Everyone on board was okay. The pilots got it down. But it was close, and the investigation cited the flight management architecture as a contributing factor. He paused again. The incident report listed the original architect as having had concerns about the system's pilot override limitations, without naming me. The implication was that the original architect, me, had designed it inadequately, that the modifications were improvements. The cabin was quiet enough that he could hear the ground equipment moving outside. And you knew they'd reversed it, Victoria said. I knew. I didn't have documentation anymore because I no longer had access. My name wasn't on anything. He looked back at her. I had a 2-year-old at home and a failing marriage, and I made the decision that the fight I needed to have was not the one I could afford to have. So I stopped fighting it. Victoria set her coffee down. She didn't say anything for a moment, and Nathan appreciated that. Appreciated that she didn't rush to fill the silence with something that would make her feel better about it. What are you doing now? She asked finally. Professionally? Contract maintenance work, he said. I do diagnostic consulting for smaller operators, regional airlines, charter companies, nothing that requires my old credentials. A beat. It pays enough. It lets me be available for Lily. How old is she? 8. He looked down at the backpack. She's got a cardiac condition, has had it since she was born. She's had 2 procedures already. This morning's is... He stopped, pressed his lips together briefly. They think this one should be the last one, if it goes well. Victoria Sterling looked at Nathan Drake, the worn jacket, the shadows under his eyes, the child's backpack with the cartoon airplane, and something in her face shifted. Not the assessment calculation, not the executive reading a situation, something older and more human than that. I owe you an apology, she said. You don't need to... I do. She said it firmly, without making it a performance. I made an assumption based on how you looked, and I acted on it without asking the obvious questions. That was wrong, and it almost cost everyone on this aircraft something significant. She held his gaze. I'm sorry, Mr. Drake. He nodded, accepted it without turning it into a moment. Nathan, he said. Nathan. She glanced toward the cockpit. We'll be wheels up in about 15 minutes. We'll get you to San Francisco. He exhaled. Just a fraction, just enough to register. Thank you. What neither of them said, what was sitting in the cabin between them like an object no one had named yet, was the other thing. The route change. The corrupted destination data in the flight management computer. The automated update that had redirected the aircraft to a private strip 60 miles northeast of the city, timed to arrive during what would have been the exact window of Victoria's acquisition meeting. The lockout that the Guardian system had triggered. The question of who, among the small number of people with access to Sterling Aviation's dispatch authorization codes, had sent that command. Marcus Hale had been in the executive terminal since before Nathan boarded. Marcus Hale controlled a significant portion of Sterling Aviation's internal operations. Marcus Hale was, at this moment, sitting 12 feet forward in the cabin, apparently reading something on his tablet with perfect composure. Nathan didn't say any of this to Victoria. He had no proof. He had a pattern and a timeline, and a very specific instinct honed by 8 years of engineering work in an industry where getting things wrong meant people died. And that instinct was telling him something that he needed to be certain about before he put it into words. He needed to see the module. There was something else he'd noticed when he was working in the cockpit, something that had registered at the edge of his attention while he was focused on the authentication reset and that he'd filed away to return to. A signal anomaly in the system diagnostic readout, not a software issue. A hardware signature, something that didn't belong in the aircraft's network architecture, something broadcasting on a narrow-band frequency that wouldn't show up on standard maintenance scans unless you knew exactly where to look and what you were looking at. He needed to get into the avionics bay. He caught Chen's eye as she walked back through the cabin doing her pre-departure checks. She stopped beside his seat, and he leaned slightly forward and said, quietly enough that his voice didn't carry, "During cruise, can you arrange access to the forward avionics bay?" She looked at him for a moment. "Why?" "I need to check something I saw in the diagnostic readout. It's probably nothing." He paused. "It's probably not nothing." Chen studied him for 3 seconds. Then she said, "I'll let you know when we're at altitude." The aircraft began to move. Nathan leaned back in his seat and held the blue backpack in his lap and watched Portland fall away outside the window as they taxied toward the runway. His mind was running 2 tracks simultaneously, the problem on the aircraft and the problem at the hospital, and keeping them separate required a specific kind of mental discipline that he'd developed over years of working in high-stakes environments. The ability to compartmentalize, not by ignoring one thing, but by placing it somewhere specific in his thinking and trusting himself to return to it. Lily is in good hands. Dr. Reyes is excellent. You will be there. The aircraft will not fly itself into a trap, not while you're on it. The runway stretched ahead, the engines building, and Nathan Drake held his daughter's backpack and watched the world accelerate past the window and then drop away below as the jet lifted into the morning sky. His aircraft, his code, his architecture pulling them into the air with the silent certainty of something built by someone who had refused, even when it cost him everything, to take shortcuts with things that mattered. At cruising altitude, 23 minutes into the flight, Chen appeared at his row. "Bay's accessible," she said. "I'll take you." He followed her forward, past the galley, through a service panel, down a short ladder into the forward avionics bay. A low, cramped space full of rack-mounted electronics and cable runs, and the particular smell of electronics running warm, a smell Nathan had always found oddly calming, the smell of systems doing their job. He crouched and moved through the space with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years in exactly this kind of environment, running his hands along cable bundles, reading labels, checking connection points. He found it in about 4 minutes. It was tucked behind the primary data concentrator unit, wedged into a space between two cable harnesses in a way that was clearly deliberate. Someone had known exactly where to put it to minimize the chance of detection during a standard inspection. It was a small module, roughly the size of a deck of cards, matte black, with 2 data connections and a narrowband transmitter integrated into its body. Nathan stared at it for a long time without touching it. He was looking at a device that had no legitimate reason to exist in this aircraft. A device that, based on its position and its connections, was wired directly into the flight management computer's secondary data bus, the bus that handled navigation routing and destination data. This was not a software update. This was not a corrupted dispatch command that someone had sent by accident or through negligence. This was hardware, installed physically, inside the aircraft, by someone with physical access to this specific avionics bay. The route change to RVK4 hadn't been sent remotely through a dispatch system. It had been loaded directly into the flight management computer through this device on a timer designed to activate during the departure sequence and redirect the aircraft before anyone on board could identify the source. Nathan sat back on his heels in the cramped space and breathed through his nose and looked at the small black module and understood something that made the back of his neck go cold. This hadn't been designed to crash the aircraft. The Guardian system would have caught any command that threatened flight safety. Whoever built this device knew the Guardian system, knew it well enough to know its limits, to know exactly what kind of command it would block and what kind it would permit. A destination change wasn't a safety threat by itself. The system would catch it only because of the departure sequence authentication, which the device's programmer had not anticipated, would lock the entire aircraft. This had been designed to make Victoria Sterling disappear for 6 hours, land at a remote private airstrip 60 miles from where she needed to be. No communication, no explanation, no way to reach her acquisition meeting, just a CEO who failed to show up at the most critical moment of her company's expansion, and a malfunction log that would show an unavoidable technical issue. Nathan reached into his pocket and found the small multi-tool he always carried and began, very carefully and very methodically, documenting everything before he touched anything. He used his phone camera, photographing the device from 4 angles, the connection points, the position within the bay. Then he began, carefully and slowly, detaching the data connections. He did not pull the module. Not yet. He wanted to bring someone with him as a witness before he did that. He climbed back out of the bay and found Chen waiting. "I need you to see something," he said, "and I need you to bring your captain." She looked at his face. "How bad?" Nathan thought about how to answer that. "It's not going to hurt anyone," he said, "but somebody put it there on purpose, and the person who did it has been sitting 12 feet from your cockpit this entire flight." Chen was quiet for 1 second. Then she turned and walked toward the front of the aircraft, and Nathan followed her, and the morning sunlight cut through the oval windows at a low angle and laid itself across the carpet in long golden strips. And somewhere below them, the California coast was coming into view, and Nathan Drake was running out of time in more than one direction. Graves came back with Chen. He looked at the module. He looked at the photographs on Nathan's phone. He was very quiet for a long time, the quiet of a man recalibrating something significant. "I've been flying for 22 years, he said finally, to no one in particular, and I've never seen anything like this. "Photograph it yourself before we pull it," Nathan said. "Both of you, document the position, the connections, everything. When we land, you hand that documentation to airport security, and nobody touches the aircraft until the investigation team has been through it." Graves looked at him. "And Ms. Sterling?" Nathan straightened up, brushed the dust from the avionics bay off his knees. "I'll talk to her." He walked back into the main cabin. Marcus Hale was still in his seat, tablet on his lap, with the particular air of a man who was being very deliberately relaxed. Victoria was on a phone call at the rear of the aircraft. Nathan walked to her, waited for her to finish, and when she lowered the phone, he said, quietly and directly, "I need 5 minutes." She read his face. "Now?" "Yes." They moved to the rear galley, away from the other passengers. Nathan told her what he'd found. He told her what it meant. He told her about the timer function, the secondary data bus connection, the narrowband transmitter. He told her about RVK-4. He told her that whoever had installed the device had physical access to this aircraft. Not remote access, physical. And had done it recently enough that it hadn't been caught in the last maintenance inspection, which meant either the inspection had been inadequate or the access had happened after it. Victoria stood with her back against the galley counter and listened without interrupting. The composure was still there, but it was a different quality now. Not the smooth professional surface, but the composure of someone holding something very heavy and not putting it down. "The acquisition meeting," she said when he finished. "If you'd landed at RVK-4, you'd have missed it entirely," Nathan said. 6 hours minimum, probably more, between the misdirection, the communications delay, getting back to the city. Whatever the deal structure is, the window closes. She closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds, opened them. "The deal closes today at noon or not at all. I've been working toward this for 18 months. "I know," Nathan said, though he didn't, not the specifics. "Whoever did this knew that too." She looked toward the front of the aircraft. Not at Marcus Hale directly, she was too controlled for that, but in that direction. "You told me to keep Marcus away from the flight systems. I told you what I needed. I didn't make an accusation. But you have one." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "I have a device. I have a timeline. I have a route change that required dispatch authorization codes and physical access to this aircraft. The investigation will have a device, photographs, connection logs, and the route change record. What it makes of that isn't my call." Victoria Sterling looked at Nathan Drake in the narrow galley of her private aircraft, this man she had dismissed 2 hours ago. This man whose code had locked her jet to the ground, and whose code had also just prevented something she still wasn't fully able to articulate the shape of. And she looked at him with the expression of someone who was adding things up and arriving at a number that was making her slightly ill. "Nathan," she said, When we land, I need to get to a hospital," he said, simply, finally. "Everything else can wait." She nodded. And for the first time since she'd boarded this aircraft, Victoria Sterling looked at him not as a variable in a situation, but as a person carrying something real, and the difference between those two things showed clearly on her face. "We'll have a car waiting on the tarmac," she said. "You'll be at the hospital before 8. He exhaled. The first full exhale he'd managed in hours. "Thank you." Outside, the California coast spread below them in the early morning light. The bay, the bridge, the city coming into focus. And the Guardian flight system, the architecture that Nathan Drake had built and lost and never quite let go of, carried them toward the runway with the steady, unhurried certainty of something that had been designed, from the very beginning, to bring people home safely. The car was waiting exactly as Victoria had promised. A black sedan, engine running, a driver standing beside it on the private tarmac at San Francisco Executive Airfield, with a look of professional patience that broke slightly when Nathan came down the aircraft stairs still carrying a child's backpack and moving with the focused urgency of a man who had been running on cortisol and willpower for the past 4 hours. Nathan didn't wait for introductions. He got in the car, gave the driver the hospital name, and spent the 11-minute drive with his phone pressed to his ear and his free hand flat against his knee, a habit he'd developed without noticing, the physical equivalent of holding himself together. Dr. Reyes's assistant answered on the second ring. "We're prepping now," she said. "Lily's been asking for you since 6. She's doing okay. She's nervous, but she's okay." "Tell her I'm 10 minutes away," Nathan said. "Tell her I got on the plane." A pause. "She'll like that," the assistant said, and her voice had the warmth of someone who had watched too many families in waiting rooms and learned to find the good moments where they existed. He hung up and looked out the window at the city moving past. The early morning San Francisco light doing that particular thing it does in summer, cutting low and golden between the buildings, making everything look briefly more significant than it probably was. He was exhausted in a way that had passed through tired and come out the other side into something almost calm, the stillness of a body that has run out of resources for panic and is simply moving forward on whatever it has left. He thought about Victoria Sterling standing in the rear galley, and about Marcus Hale sitting 12 feet from the cockpit with his tablet and his composed expression, and about the small black module currently sealed in a plastic document bag that Captain Graves had produced from somewhere and labeled in his neat pilot's handwriting with the date, the flight number, and the word suspected unauthorized device, avionics bay. He thought about these things the way you think about a fire you've reported and walked away from, aware it's burning, trusting it to the people responsible for it now, unable to do anything more until you've done the other thing you were already supposed to be doing. The hospital came into view. Nathan was out of the car before it fully stopped. Lily Drake was 8 years old and small for her age, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubbornness, and a very specific way of looking at things that adults found slightly unnerving because it suggested she was arriving at conclusions slightly ahead of where you'd expect. She had been dealing with her heart condition with the practical fatalism of a child who has never known things to be otherwise. Not brave in the performed sense, not cheerful in the forced sense, just quietly and sometimes impatiently accustomed to the reality of hospital gowns and pre-op nurses and the particular smell of medical facilities. When Nathan came through the pre-op, she looked up at him from the narrow bed and said, "You look terrible." "Good morning to you too," he said, and he sat down on the edge of the chair beside her and took her hand and held it in both of his. And he didn't say anything else for a moment because he was busy making sure she was real and present and exactly as described by the assistant on the phone. "Did you get on a plane?" she asked. "I got on a plane." "The commercial one was canceled, right? I heard Aunt Rosa talking on the phone." "There was another option," he said. She studied him with those dark eyes. "What kind of other option?" "A private jet." Her eyebrows went up. "Whose?" "Long story," he said. "I'll tell you the whole thing when you're out of surgery and yelling at me about the Jell-O options." The corner of her mouth moved. "They only ever have green." "I know. It's a conspiracy." She squeezed his hand. It was a small squeeze, the grip of a child who was frightened and wasn't going to say so directly, and he squeezed back with the careful steadiness of a father who was also frightened and also wasn't going to say so directly. And the two of them sat in that understanding for the few minutes they had before Dr. Reyes came in, and the room began filling with the organized professional activity of people preparing to take very good care of his daughter. Nathan stayed until they wheeled her out. He held her hand until the doorway, and she looked back at him once, just once, with an expression that was so purely itself, so entirely Lily, that it lodged somewhere in his chest and stayed there. Then the door closed. He found a chair in the waiting room, sat down, and for the first time in 6 hours let himself stop moving. His phone rang 11 minutes later. The number was Victoria Sterling's. He almost didn't answer. Not from avoidance, more from the simple animal need to sit still for 5 more minutes. But he answered because he'd started something on that aircraft that had its own momentum now, and ignoring it wouldn't make it less true. "Nathan." Her voice was different from the aircraft. Still controlled, but with something underneath it that hadn't been there before. A tautness that wasn't professional tension, but something more personal. "Are you at the hospital?" "Waiting room," he said. "She's in surgery." "Okay." A brief pause. "I need to tell you what's happening because I think you need to know, and because—" She stopped, started again. "Because you're part of this whether either of us planned that." He leaned forward in the waiting room chair with his elbows on his knees. "Tell me." The acquisition meeting had happened. It had started at 8:30, 40 minutes late because Victoria had gone directly from the airfield to the meeting location, and the delay had required an explanation that she'd given in the minimum number of words. Technical issue on the flight, resolved, we're here. And the other party had accepted it because they had spent 18 months on this deal, and 40 minutes did not feel like a reason to walk away. The meeting itself had apparently gone well, or well enough. Victoria was guarded about specifics on the phone, which Nathan understood, but her tone when she mentioned it had the particular quality of someone who had gotten through something difficult without dropping anything irreplaceable. But that wasn't what she was calling about. What she was calling about was Marcus Hale. "He tried to leave the airfield before airport security got there," she said. "One of the ground crew held him at the gate. Not detained, technically, just delayed on a maintenance question, long enough for the security team to arrive." Nathan said nothing, waited. "His phone," Victoria said. "The security team requested it as part of the incident documentation, since he was listed as a senior passenger. He complied because he didn't have a legal basis to refuse at that stage. And on his phone, Nathan, he had a complete record. Not the dispatch command itself that was routed through a server we haven't traced yet, but communications. Messages. A separate encrypted channel that our IT team was able to crack. She paused. He's been working with two of our board members. For months. The acquisition. If I'd missed that meeting today, the deal would have collapsed. Our company charter has a provision that allows the board to call an emergency leadership review in cases of, it's complicated language, but essentially CEO failure to fulfill a material corporate obligation. Missing the acquisition meeting would have qualified. They'd have used it to remove you, Nathan said. They'd have used it to call a review, yes. And with the two board members Marcus had aligned, plus two others he'd been working on, they'd have had the votes. Her voice was steady, but it was the steadiness of someone pressing their thumb against a cut. He's been positioning for this for 8 months. This acquisition was the trigger. If it fell apart, if I failed to close it, he had the mechanism to push me out and install himself as interim CEO during the review period. Nathan sat with this for a moment. The waiting room around him had its own quiet rhythm. A television in the corner playing morning news with the sound barely audible. A woman across the room knitting. An older man reading a newspaper with the patient concentration of someone with nowhere urgent to be. The ordinary texture of waiting. The device on the aircraft, he said. He had access. He was at the airfield the previous afternoon for what he told my operations team was a routine inspection review. He had standing clearance to accompany maintenance teams. She paused. He knows the aircraft. He's been on it dozens of times. Does he know the Guardian system? A longer pause. He was part of the evaluation team when Sterling acquired the technology portfolio. He reviewed the system documentation. Nathan closed his eyes briefly. But not the original documentation, the archived version. What do you mean? The original design documents, my design documents, had the authentication architecture in them, the detailed structure of the fail-safe systems. If whoever modified the Guardian system before Sterling acquired it had stripped those sections out, which based on what you told me about the Apex integrated documentation I think they did, then Marcus would have been working from incomplete technical specs. He'd have known the Guardian system existed and broadly what it did. He wouldn't have known about the departure authentication lock. Nathan opened his eyes. He didn't expect the aircraft to lock out. He expected the route redirect to go through silently and the aircraft to depart on schedule. So he built a plan around a system he didn't fully understand, Victoria said slowly. He built a plan around the version of the system that the people who stole it from me left him, which was missing its most important piece. Nathan paused. My piece. The silence on the line had a specific quality. The quality of a person recalibrating something large and structural, not just the immediate situation, but the history underneath it. Nathan, Victoria said, I need to ask you something directly. Okay? The Guardian system, the version on my aircraft, the version Sterling acquired. Is it your system, legally? Do you have any documentation of original authorship? He laughed, very briefly, not with amusement. I have some things. Not much. When they let me go, they restricted my access to the project files immediately, same day. I had personal notes, early design sketches, a couple of emails I'd saved to a personal account, because I had a feeling. Nothing that by itself would satisfy a legal standard. He paused. But the system itself is documentation. The architecture has signatures in it, structural choices that reflect specific design philosophies, specific solutions to specific problems. An expert who looked at the original code and looked at my other work from that period would be able to see it. I want to do that, Victoria said. I want an independent technical review. My legal team has already flagged the Apex integrated acquisition as something we need to investigate, given today's... She stopped, reorganized her words. Given everything. Will you cooperate with that? Yes, Nathan said. I should tell you, she said, and now there was something almost careful in her voice, the way people sound when they're about to say something that costs them something, that if the review confirms what you're telling me, and based on everything I've seen today I think it will, Sterling Aviation has significant legal exposure. The technology your name is absent from is fundamental to our certification. If we acquired it under fraudulent documentation, I'm not interested in destroying your company, Nathan said. I want you to understand that. That's not what this is. What is it? He thought about how to answer that. In the waiting room, the woman with the knitting had gotten up and gone to the coffee machine. The television was showing weather. Outside the window, the San Francisco morning was fully established now, the golden light from earlier replaced by the flat, bright clarity of midday approaching. 7 years ago, I built something because I believed that pilots should always be in control of their aircraft, Nathan said. Not automation, not software written by someone trying to reduce departure delays by 4 minutes. Pilots. Human beings in the cockpit who know what's happening and can stop it if it goes wrong. He paused. They took that out of my system and then they blamed me for the results. And then a company I'd never heard of acquired the technology and flew aircraft with it, and nobody knew that the thing keeping those aircraft safe was mine, or that the people who sold it had gutted the most important part. He paused again. So what I want is for that to not be true anymore. I want the original system restored and my name on it. That's what I want. A long pause. Okay, Victoria said quietly. And I want to get back to waiting for my daughter, he said. Of course. Nathan, I'll call you when I have more. He put the phone in his pocket and sat back in the chair and waited. He had been sitting there for approximately 40 minutes, long enough to drink a bad cup of vending machine coffee and reject a second one, when his phone rang again. Not Victoria this time. A number he didn't recognize, a San Francisco area code. He answered. Mr. Drake. Male voice, professional. The specific cadence of law enforcement that Nathan recognized from the one time in his life he'd had to give a statement after a workplace incident. This is Special Agent Torres, Federal Aviation Security Division. I understand you were a passenger on Sterling Aviation flight from Portland this morning, and that you discovered a device in the forward avionics bay. That's correct. We've been working with Captain Graves and the Sterling Aviation ground team since the aircraft landed. I'd like to speak with you in person when you're available. Mr. Graves mentioned your daughter is in surgery. She is. We can wait, Torres said, and he said it with a directness that Nathan appreciated. Not take your time or whenever you're ready, both of which would have felt like performances, but simply stating a fact. We can wait. Can I ask you a preliminary question? Go ahead. The device you identified in the avionics bay. You have an engineering background in flight management systems? Yes? In your assessment, was the device designed to cause a safety of flight issue? Nathan thought about this carefully before answering. It was the kind of question where the precise answer mattered, where the difference between what he knew and what he suspected was important to maintain. No, he said. In my assessment, the device was designed to redirect the aircraft to an alternate destination without the knowledge of the flight crew. It was not designed to interfere with flight controls, navigation accuracy, or any system that would affect the physical safety of the aircraft. He paused. However, I want to be clear that I'm giving you my engineering assessment of the device's apparent intent. I cannot tell you what would have happened in practice. Any unauthorized hardware in a certified aircraft's avionics bay represents a safety concern regardless of intent. Understood. Torres made a sound that might have been a note being written. One more question. Are you familiar with a company called Apex Integrated Systems? Nathan was quiet for a moment. Yes. In what context? I worked there, Nathan said. A long time ago. Another pause, longer this time. Mr. Drake, I think we're going to need more than one conversation. I expect you're right, Nathan said. Come to the hospital. There's a waiting room on the 3rd floor. I'll be here for a while. Torres arrived an hour and 20 minutes later with a colleague he introduced as Agent Park, and a digital recorder, and the patient, unhurried manner of an investigator who understood that the shape of a situation often looked completely different after you sat with it for a while. Nathan told him everything. He told it in order, without editorializing, the way he'd learned to communicate in engineering environments where precision mattered, and extra words created confusion. He told Torres about the flight, about the authentication lock, about the module in the avionics bay. He told him about Apex Integrated and the Guardian system and what had been done to it and to him. He pulled up the photographs he'd taken in the avionics bay and transferred them to Torres's phone. Torres and Park listened without interrupting. They asked follow-up questions that were specific and well-targeted, the questions of people who already had some context and were filling in particular gaps. At one point, Torres showed Nathan a photograph on his own phone, a photograph of the module that the ground team had extracted from the aircraft, and asked Nathan to confirm it was what he'd found. It was. At one point, Park asked, "You said the device required knowledge of the secondary data bus architecture. How many people would have that level of technical knowledge of this specific aircraft? In the general population? Very few, Nathan said. In the Sterling Aviation Technical Operations team, maybe 8 to 12 people. Among people who had reviewed the Guardian system documentation, maybe a handful more. He paused. The person who built this device either had significant technical expertise or was working with someone who did. Park wrote something. Could it have been built from information in the publicly available technical documentation for the Guardian system? No, Nathan said. The secondary data bus architecture wasn't in any documentation I've seen in the public record. That information would have had to come from internal Sterling Aviation sources or from the original Apex integrated project files. The two agents looked at each other. Mr. Drake, Torres said, I want to be straightforward with you. The investigation into Mr. Hale and the two board members has already produced significant material. What you've told us this afternoon fits that material in ways that are not coincidental. He leaned forward slightly. We're going to need formal documentation of your original authorship of the Guardian flight system's core architecture. We understand you may have limited documentation from the Apex period. I have what I have, Nathan said. We have subpoena authority for Apex Integrated's archived project files, Torres said. Apex dissolved as a corporate entity 3 years ago, but their file archive was transferred to a data management company as part of the dissolution. We've already been in contact. He paused. If your name was in those files before it was removed, we'll find it. Nathan sat with this information for a moment. He had imagined many things over the years. Imagined what it would feel like if someone pulled those archived files, if someone looked at the original version numbers and the commit logs and the design attribution records and saw his name there in the history before it was scrubbed. He had imagined it enough times that the imagining had lost some of its charge. It had become more of a theoretical than an emotional exercise. A thing that might someday happen, in the same category as things that might someday happen to other people. He discovered now that it hadn't lost its charge at all. I'd appreciate that, he said, and his voice came out slightly different than he intended, and he cleared his throat and looked at the door. As if on cue, Dr. Reyes appeared in the waiting room doorway. Nathan was on his feet before he was aware of standing. Torres and Park both went still with the automatic courtesy of people who recognize when a scene has changed. Dr. Reyes was a compact woman in her late 40s with reading glasses pushed up on her head and the specific quality of controlled exhaustion that surgeons have after a procedure that has required significant sustained attention. She looked at Nathan, and something in her expression shifted. Not to the bad expression, not to the expression he had been bracing for every hour for the past 3 months, to something else. Something that had the quality of relief trying to be professional about itself. She's out, Dr. Reyes said. She did very well. Better than I expected, honestly. Her heart responded exactly the way we were hoping. She's in recovery and she'll be groggy for a few hours, but she paused. Nathan, I think this is the last one. He didn't say anything. He pressed his hands together in front of his face, fingers touching his mouth, and breathed through his nose for a moment. The repair is solid, Dr. Reyes continued, with the careful precision of someone who had learned not to promise things she couldn't stand behind. The structural issue we've been managing since she was 3. The tissue response today suggests that the correction is holding the way it needs to. I want to monitor her for 6 weeks, and I want follow-up imaging at 3 months and 6 months. But based on what I saw in there today, she looked at him directly. She's going to be okay. He nodded. He kept nodding for a moment longer than was necessary, because stopping required a muscle he wasn't sure he had access to right now. Can I see her? In about 20 minutes, when she's a little more awake. She asked about you as she was coming out of anesthesia, so she's already herself, Nathan said. Dr. Reyes smiled. Very much so. After she left, Torres stood up. Mr. Drake, we'll follow up tomorrow. Take the time you need today. He held out a card. Call me if anything else comes to mind. Nathan took the card, shook Torres's hand, then Park's. They left. He sat back down in the chair and put his face in his hands for a moment and stayed there in the private dark behind his palms and let the morning's accumulated weight land on him all at once. The phone call at 4:17, the canceled flight, the tarmac, the cockpit, the module in the avionics bay. Victoria's voice on the phone, the small black device that had been designed by someone with access and knowledge and months of preparation, all of it converging on this waiting room in San Francisco, where his daughter had just come through surgery and a doctor had just used the word last. His phone buzzed. A text from Victoria. Hale is in federal custody. Board has been notified. I want to call you tomorrow when you've had some sleep. Thank you isn't enough, but it's what I have right now. He read it twice. Then he put the phone face down on his knee and looked up at the ceiling. The television in the corner had moved from weather to a human interest segment about a dog that had learned to open refrigerators. The woman with the knitting had come back and was working with the focused, rhythmic calm of someone who had done this so many times that the needles moved without her thinking about them. The older man had put down his newspaper and was looking out the window at the middle distance with the expression of someone thinking about something that happened a long time ago. Nathan sat in the ordinary texture of the waiting room and waited for the 20 minutes to pass so he could go see his daughter, and thought about a small black module in an avionics bay, and about 3 ascending tones and 1 low sustained note, and about a piece of software he had written 7 years ago in a different life that had looked at an unauthorized command and made the only decision it knew how to make. The decision he had built into it. Hold. Wait. Not until I know who's asking and why. He had written that into the core of the system, not because he was paranoid, or because he was difficult, or because he was trying to make the executives above him uncomfortable, though it had done all 3. He had written it because he was an engineer who understood that automation was a tool, not a replacement for judgment, and that the most important thing any safety system could do was buy time, create the pause between intention and consequence in which a human being could intervene. It had bought time today. It had bought time for him to come back up the stairs. It had bought time for Graves and Chen to see the route log. It had bought time for Torres and Park to arrive at the airfield. It had bought time for Victoria Sterling to make it to her meeting, and for Marcus Hale's phone to be in the hands of people who knew what to do with it. All the time that needed buying. A nurse appeared in the doorway and said his name. Nathan stood up, picked up the blue backpack, and followed her down the hallway. Lily was in a recovery room at the end of a corridor, in a bed that was too large for her, under a pale blue hospital blanket, with monitoring leads on her chest and an IV in her arm, and the specific unfocused expression of a child coming back to herself after anesthesia. When Nathan came through the door, she turned her head and looked at him with those dark eyes, and they were bleary and a little slow, but they were entirely hers, entirely Lily. And she said, in a voice that was rough and small and slightly confused, "Did you really get on a private jet?" He sat down beside her and took her hand. "I really did." "Whose?" "A CEO named Victoria Sterling." She considered this. "Was she nice?" He thought about it. "She's getting there," he said. Lily made a small sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a yawn. At this stage of post-anesthesia, it was hard to tell. She turned her hand over and held his properly, fingers interlaced, the way she'd held his hand since she was small. "The backpack," she said. "Did you carry it?" He held it up so she could see. She looked at the cartoon airplane on the pocket, then back at him. "Good," she said, and closed her eyes. He sat beside her while she slept, in the quiet recovery room, and outside the window, San Francisco went about its afternoon, and somewhere across the city in a federal building. A man named Marcus Hale was explaining himself to people who had his phone, and in a boardroom, Victoria Sterling was beginning to understand the full shape of what had almost happened to her company. And in an archive database somewhere in a server facility, a retrieval order had been issued for the original project files of Apex Integrated Systems, files that still existed, had always existed, that the people who had erased a name from them had not thought to destroy because they had not believed anyone would ever come looking. Nathan Drake held his daughter's hand in the afternoon light and did not think about any of this. He thought about the cartoon airplane on the backpack, and about the way she had said good, and about the word last in the mouth of a surgeon who chose her words carefully. He thought about how sometimes the thing you built to protect people protects the person you least expected, and sometimes, on the same morning, it protects you too. He slept in the hospital chair that night, not comfortably. The chair was one of those vinyl recliners that hospital waiting areas provide as a gesture toward human accommodation without fully committing to it, and Nathan woke up twice with his neck at the wrong angle and his lower back registering a formal complaint. But he didn't want to leave the building. Not yet. Not while Lily was still attached to monitors and the night nursing staff was doing their quiet rounds every hour. And so he stayed and slept badly, and woke up the third time to pale gray early light coming through the window and the sound of Lily's voice asking a night nurse whether the breakfast options were the same as yesterday. He sat up, looked at her. She was awake and slightly puffy-faced from sleep and clearly already constructing opinions about the menu situation. "Morning," he said. She looked at him in the chair. "Did you sleep there?" "Some definition of sleep, yes." "Your neck is going to hurt." "It already hurts." She made the expression she made when she had an opinion she was choosing not to share, which with Lily was always visible because she hadn't yet learned to make it invisible. Then she said, "The nurse says they have oatmeal." "Do you want oatmeal?" "I want pancakes." "You're in a hospital." "That's not an answer." He got up from the chair, stretched his back with the wincing deliberateness of a 32-year-old man who had slept in a vinyl recliner after about 40 hours of compounded stress, and went to find out about pancakes. There were no pancakes. He came back with oatmeal and a small cup of apple juice and a packet of crackers he'd gotten from a vending machine as a supplemental offering. And Lily looked at this spread with the resigned acceptance of someone who had learned that hospitals operated by their own nutritional logic and fighting. It was a waste of energy. They sat together while she ate, not talking much, the particular comfortable quiet of two people who had been through enough together that silence didn't require filling. At some point, Lily said without looking up from her oatmeal, "Is the surgery really the last one?" "Dr. Reyes thinks so." A pause. "Does she know for sure?" "She said she wants to monitor you for 6 months before she'll say for sure." He looked at her. "But she said what she saw looked the way she was hoping. That's real." Lily moved the oatmeal around with her spoon. "Okay," she said finally, "just that." "Okay." The single-syllable verdict of a child who had spent 5 years learning to hold information carefully and not get ahead of what she actually knew. He watched her and felt something that didn't have a clean name. Not quite pride, not quite grief, something that lived in the complicated territory between the two. She was 8 years old, and she already understood more about the difference between hope and certainty than most adults he'd ever met. His phone was on the side table. It had buzzed 6 times overnight, all messages he'd looked at briefly and set aside. 2 from Torres with administrative follow-up about documentation. 1 from a number he didn't have saved that turned out to be Victoria's legal counsel, a man named Bryce, asking about his availability for a call. 1 from Ray, the mechanic from Portland, which simply said, "Heard things worked out," glad with a period at the end that felt very Ray. 1 from Lily's Aunt Rosa asking for an update. And 1, sent at 11:48 p.m., from Victoria Sterling herself. The archive files came through. Torres called me tonight. "Nathan, your name is in there. Version 1 through version 4, every design document, every commit log. They removed it in the final export version. The original is untouched." He had read this at 2 a.m. during one of his waking intervals and then set the phone down and looked at the ceiling for a while. He hadn't known what to feel about it, which surprised him. He'd thought about this possibility for 6 years. He'd imagined it would feel like something clear and definitive, vindication, the sharp satisfaction of being proven right. What it actually felt like was closer to the sensation of setting down a bag you'd been carrying for so long that you'd stopped noticing the weight, and only when it left your hand did you understand how heavy it had been. He texted back, "I saw. Thank you for telling me tonight." She had replied at 11:52, "Get some sleep." He hadn't, but that wasn't her fault. Now, in the morning light, with Lily working through her oatmeal and the hospital settling into its daytime rhythm, Nathan answered the messages he'd deferred overnight. He confirmed availability with Bryce for a call that afternoon. He texted Rosa that Lily was awake and eating and doing well. He texted Torres that he was available for documentation review later in the week. He texted Ray, "It did. Thank you for making it possible." Then he put the phone away and stayed with his daughter until Dr. Reyes arrived at 8:15 for rounds. The doctor's assessment was the same as the night before, delivered in the careful clinical language of someone who wanted to be accurate without being cold. The procedure had gone as well as it could. The monitoring overnight showed the results holding. Lily could likely go home in 2 days if nothing changed. There would be follow-up appointments, restrictions on activity for several weeks, a gradual return to normal that would require patience from both of them. Lily listened to all of this with the focused attention she gave to things that mattered to her and said, "Can I go back to school before the 3 months?" Dr. Reyes looked at her. Probably in about 3 to 4 weeks, depending. What about gym class? Lily, Nathan said. That's an important question, Lily said to him, not defensively but with genuine conviction. I'm in a soccer unit. Dr. Reyes pressed her lips together in a way that was clearly suppressing a smile. We'll talk about activity levels at your 4-week follow-up, she said. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Lily accepted this verdict with the measured patience of someone who had not given up but recognized when a negotiation had reached its natural pause. After Dr. Reyes left, Nathan sat back down in his chair, the daytime version of the same chair, which was not more comfortable but felt less oppressive with sunlight in the room, and looked at his daughter and thought, not for the first time, that whatever he had gotten wrong in his life, and the list was not short, this particular thing he had gotten right. The call with Bryce happened at 2 o'clock, while Lily slept. Nathan took it in a family consultation room down the hall, a small space with 2 chairs and a table and a box of tissues on the counter that suggested the room had a particular regular purpose. Bryce was a precise, efficient man who communicated in a style that managed to be both thorough and fast, which Nathan appreciated. He walked Nathan through what Sterling Aviation's legal team had in hand, the archive documentation Torres had retrieved, which showed Nathan's authorship across all 4 versions of the Guardian system. The communications recovered from Hale's phone, which included detailed discussions with the 2 board members about the acquisition sabotage timeline. The module itself, which had been sent to a federal forensic lab and whose internal firmware, according to the preliminary analysis, contained code structures that matched development signatures traceable to a third-party contractor with prior relationships to Apex integrated systems. That last piece is significant, Bryce said, because it creates a chain. The contractor who wrote the device firmware had access to the Apex project files. Those files include your original design documentation. The firmware exploits a specific vulnerability in the Guardian architecture that is only described in internal Apex documentation that has your name on it as the author. Nathan was quiet for a moment. Whoever built the device needed to know my original system well enough to work around it. Exactly. And they couldn't have gotten that knowledge from the modified version Sterling acquired. They needed the original. Bryce paused. We believe Marcus Hale had access to a copy of the original Apex files through his prior professional relationship with one of the Apex executives, a relationship that predated his employment with Sterling by several years. He knew the company that stole my work, Nathan said. He knew the people, Bryce said, which means he may have known what was in those files significantly longer than anyone at Sterling. The implication of this took a moment to settle. Marcus Hale, the man who had gestured toward the back of the cabin with the efficient economy of someone dismissing a variable, the man who had sat 12 feet from the cockpit with his tablet and his composed expression. That man had possibly known, before he ever boarded that aircraft, who Nathan Drake actually was. Had possibly known the whole shape of it and said nothing, had instead processed it as a manageable factor, a detail to work around. I want to ask you something directly, Nathan said. Victoria, Ms. Sterling, what is her position in all of this? She acquired a technology portfolio that contained stolen work. Her company has operated using that technology for 4 years. Bryce was quiet for a moment, the silence of a lawyer choosing words with the specific care of someone who understood that what he said next would be quoted back to him eventually. Ms. Sterling acquired the portfolio in good faith based on the documentation provided by Apex Integrated at the time of dissolution. There is no indication, and the recovered communications support this, that she had any knowledge of the authorship issue. She was, in effect, also a victim of what Apex did. I understand that, Nathan said. What I'm asking is what her position is going forward, toward me. A shorter pause. She wants to meet with you. In person. With her board, the remaining board members, not the 2 who are currently under investigation. She wants you present for a formal review. Bryce paused again. She has been very direct with me about what she believes the outcome of that review should be. What does she believe it should be? She believes your authorship should be formally recognized. She believes the Guardian system should be restored to your original specifications. And she believes Sterling Aviation has an obligation to you that goes beyond legal settlement. He said this carefully, as a man reporting someone else's stated position, not endorsing it. She asked me to tell you that specifically, that she's not interested in settling. She's interested in making it right. Nathan looked at the box of tissues on the counter. Someone had folded the top tissue into a small point, a bit of origami that the room's last occupant had probably done without thinking, the fidgeting of someone sitting with something hard. "Tell her I'll come," he said. "When Lily is discharged and settled, a week, maybe 10 days. "I'll let her know," Bryce said. "And Nathan, for what it's worth personally, what I've read in those archive files this week, you built something serious, the kind of thing that doesn't come along very often." Nathan didn't know how to respond to that, so he said thank you and hung up and sat in the small consultation room for a few minutes before going back to his daughter. The 10 days passed in the way that recovery time passes, slowly during the difficult hours and quickly in aggregate, so that when Nathan looked back on it later, the whole period compressed into a series of specific images. Lily eating actual pancakes on her second morning home, which her Aunt Rosa had made from scratch, and which were, Rosa declared, non-negotiable, regardless of what the hospital nutritional guidelines said. Lily doing her homework at the kitchen table with the focused irritation of a person who felt well enough to be bored and was therefore ready to return to the world. Nathan on the phone with Torres twice more, providing additional technical documentation. Nathan at his kitchen table at midnight with a cup of coffee and the original design files he'd kept on a personal hard drive, sketches, notes, early architecture diagrams, the handwritten legal pad pages from the first months of the Guardian project, spreading them out and looking at them for the first time in years, reacquainting himself with the person who had made them. He had been 25 when he started the project. He could see it in the work. The ambition of it, the sometimes overcomplicated solutions of someone who was still learning which problems required elegance and which just required stubbornness. But the core idea had been right from the beginning. He could see that too. The pilot authority architecture, the departure authentication, the layered fail-safe logic, all of it had come from a very simple conviction that he'd held then and still held. That safety was not a feature you added to a system. It was a principle you built the system around from the ground up, or it wasn't safety at all. It was theater. On the morning of the 11th day, he drove Lily to school. She got out of the car with her backpack, her regular school backpack, not the cartoon airplane one, which had been returned to its spot on her closet shelf, and walked toward the entrance and then turned around and came back to the car window. "Are you going to be okay today?" she asked. He looked at her. "I'm going to a meeting." "About the airplane stuff?" "Yes." She considered him with those dark eyes. "Are you nervous?" "A little," he admitted. She nodded, accepting this with the solemnity she gave to information she considered important. "You should probably fix your collar," she said. "It's doing the thing." He reached up and straightened his collar. She gave this a brief, evaluating look and apparently found it adequate, because she turned around and walked into the school without looking back, which was her standard departure method and which he had learned meant she was fine. He drove to San Francisco. The Sterling Aviation offices occupied the top 2 floors of a glass and steel building near the financial district, the kind of building that communicated prosperity through its bones. Not flashy, not ostentatious, just the solid, assured aesthetic of a company that knew what it was. Nathan had been in buildings like this before, on the other side of the table, years ago. He had also been outside of them, in the parking lot, cleaning out a cardboard box. He wore a jacket, not his worn work jacket, a better one, charcoal gray, that Rosa had produced from somewhere and pressed the night before with the wordless efficiency of a woman who understood that some days required more than the clothes you had. The lobby receptionist brought him to a conference room on the top floor, a room with a long table and a wall of windows looking west toward the bay, and Nathan stood at the window for the few minutes he had alone in the room and looked at the water and thought about nothing in particular, which was a skill he had developed specifically for moments when thinking about particular things wasn't useful. Victoria arrived first, before the board members, which Nathan suspected was intentional. She looked different from the aircraft. Not more formal, she'd been formal on the aircraft. Different in a way that was harder to name, something in how she held herself. Slightly less constructed, as though she'd made a decision to remove one layer of professional armor and hadn't yet decided whether it was permanent. She was in a navy blazer and dark trousers, and she crossed the room and shook his hand with the directness of someone who had decided that anything more elaborate would be wrong, and anything less would also be wrong. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Thank you for asking." She looked at him for a moment, not the assessment look. Something more straightforward than that. How's Lily? She went back to school this morning. She had opinions about my collar. Something in Victoria's face relaxed slightly. Good sign. That's what I thought. The board members arrived over the next few minutes. 4 of them, the 4 who remained after the 2 under investigation, had been suspended pending the federal inquiry. They ranged from a white-haired man in his late 60s named Hartwell, who had the measured, slightly weary authority of someone who had been through several corporate crises in his career and was navigating this one with his dignity intact, to a younger woman named Priya, who had joined the board 18 months ago and who looked at Nathan with the unguarded attention of someone encountering a situation entirely outside her previous frame of reference. There were also 2 members of Sterling Aviation's senior engineering team, a technical director named Warren and his colleague, a systems engineer named Deb, who had been asked to provide the board with an independent technical assessment of Nathan's original Guardian documentation. The meeting was supposed to last 2 hours. It lasted 4. Not because it was contentious, it wasn't, or not in the way Nathan had half expected. There was no argument about the fundamental facts. The archive documentation was clear. The version history was clear. Warren and Deb's technical assessment, which they had prepared over the previous week, was unambiguous in its conclusion. The core architecture of the Guardian flight system, versions 1 through 4, had been designed and built by Nathan Drake. The modified version 4.1 that Sterling had acquired from Apex Integrated had made specific changes to that architecture, changes that removed the pilot authority, hard lock, and altered the departure authentication sequence. The changes had been made after Nathan's departure from the project, by a contractor, without technical justification and against the documented recommendations of the original architect. Warren presented this with the flat, careful precision of a technical professional who had spent a week looking at something and arrived at conclusions he hadn't expected and was now presenting them because they were what he'd found, regardless of what they meant for the company that employed him. Nathan respected this considerably. What took time was not the factual establishment. It was everything that followed from it. Hartwell asked Nathan to explain, in his own words, what the original Guardian philosophy had been designed to do. Nathan explained it. He used plain language, the way he always did, because the people who most needed to understand safety systems were rarely the people who spoke engineering fluently, and that had always been his conviction, that the gap between engineers and the people responsible for the machines was a gap that cost lives. Flight automation is a tool, he said, a good tool. It reduces human error in specific, well-defined situations, but it's not judgment. It doesn't know the difference between a sensor reading that's wrong and a sensor reading that's accurate. It doesn't know what's happening outside the cockpit. The pilot does. The Guardian system was built around one principle. When there's a conflict between automation and human judgment, the human wins, every time, no exceptions. Priya leaned forward. The modification that removed the hard lock. Do you have a sense of why they made it? Because the hard lock slowed down departure sequences on certain aircraft configurations by an average of about 4 minutes, Nathan said. On a high-volume private aviation operation, over the course of a year, that's a meaningful amount of delay time. Someone decided that 4 minutes was worth more than the principle. The room was quiet for a moment. The incident that cited the modified system, Hartwell said carefully. 2 years after you left the project, the near miss on approach. Yes. The pilots tried to override the automated guidance, and the system prioritized the automated command. Yes. That would not have happened under your original architecture. No, Nathan said. Under my original architecture, the moment a pilot applied manual override input, the automated command would have terminated, immediately and completely. That was the whole point. Hartwell nodded slowly. He had the expression of a man who had been in business long enough to have seen the specific sequence where a decision that makes economic sense destroys something that makes human sense, and who had never entirely made peace with how common that sequence was. Then Victoria said something that Nathan hadn't expected. I want to ask Nathan to speak to what he thinks Sterling Aviation should do going forward, she said. Not the legal question. Bryce is handling the legal question. I mean, the operating question, the engineering question. She looked at Nathan directly. You know this system better than anyone in this room. What does it need? He had not prepared for this question, which meant his answer came from somewhere more immediate than prepared remarks. Restore the original architecture, he said. Version 4, The original, not the modified version. Reinstate the pilot authority hard lock. Recertify every aircraft in your fleet that runs the Guardian system against the original specification. He paused. And then change something that isn't in the code. What's that? Priya asked. When I raised concerns about removing the hard lock, I put them in writing, Nathan said. Multiple times, to multiple people above me. Those concerns were noted, discussed, and overridden by people who were not engineers. The engineers who agreed with me were also overridden. He looked around the table. What you need is a policy that says safety objections from engineers cannot be overridden by anyone who is not an engineer and cannot be implemented without a formal review that includes the objecting engineer's documented response. Not as a veto. Engineers don't get a veto on business decisions, but as a requirement. If you're going to change something that an engineer has told you in writing is a safety concern, you have to document your reasoning in the same language they used to raise the concern, and that documentation has to be reviewed by an independent technical authority before implementation. The room was very quiet. Warren, the technical director, was looking at Nathan with an expression that was specific and readable. The expression of an engineer who has wanted to hear exactly this said in exactly this room for a long time. That would have changed everything, Warren said quietly. Yes, Nathan said, it would have. After the formal part of the meeting concluded, the board members gathered in the kind of low conversational clusters that form at the end of significant meetings, the processing and the logistics mixed together. Hartwell shook Nathan's hand and said something measured and genuine about the company's obligation, which Nathan received without performance. Priya asked him a technical question about recertification timelines that was specific and intelligent and suggested she'd been reading the documentation carefully, which he answered honestly, including the parts that were complicated. Warren came to him last, when the room was mostly cleared. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s with the slightly battered look of someone who had spent his career in hangars and on tarmacs rather than in conference rooms. And he said without preamble, I've been the technical director here for 3 years. That hard lock removal has bothered me since the first time I looked at the system documentation. Did you say so? I flagged it, twice. Was told it had been reviewed prior to acquisition and met certification standards. He paused. Which it did. On paper. On paper, Nathan agreed. Warren looked at him. Deb is going to lead the recertification project. She's very good. But I'd like to ask, if it's not presumptuous, whether you'd be willing to consult on it. Not officially yet. That's above my pay grade to offer. Just informally, to start. She has questions that the documentation doesn't answer. Nathan thought about Lily's soccer unit, about the contract maintenance work in Portland that kept the lights on, about the apartment with the narrow kitchen and the 4-month-old coffee he'd been sitting with when the phone rang at 4:17 in the morning that had started all of this. Tell her to call me, he said. He found Victoria in the hallway outside the conference room, on the phone, finishing a conversation. She saw him and held up one finger, 1 minute, and wrapped up the call with the brisk efficiency of someone who could end conversations precisely at the moment she chose. She put the phone in her pocket. The board is moving to formally recognize your authorship, she said. The resolution will be drafted this week. Legal is preparing the documentation package. Bryce mentioned something about a settlement structure. Bryce is going to call you, she said. I want to be honest. The legal structure is complicated, and I don't want to oversimplify it here. But I want you to know my position, which is separate from the legal position. She looked at him steadily. What Apex did to you was a specific and deliberate injury. What Sterling did, what I did, without knowing it, compounded that injury. The settlement will address the legal dimension, but I want to do something that the settlement doesn't require and that you don't have to accept. What's that? Your name on the system, she said. Publicly. Not just in the internal engineering records. In our certification documentation, our technical manuals, our public safety disclosures. The Guardian flight system, designed by Nathan Drake. That's how we refer to it from this point. Everywhere. Permanently. He was quiet for a moment. And the advisory role, she said. If you want it. Warren mentioned he spoke to you about the recertification project. That's a starting point, not an end point. I want someone in this company who will tell me when a safety decision is wrong, even if I don't want to hear it. Especially if I don't want to hear it. She paused. I have a feeling you'd be comfortable doing that. I've been comfortable doing it my entire career, Nathan said. It hasn't always worked out well for me. It will here, Victoria said. That's a thing I can promise because I'm the one setting the policy. She paused. I'm not going to pretend I have this figured out. Running a company honestly is harder than running it the way I was running it before. I'm learning that. She looked out the hallway window toward the bay. But I'd rather learn it than not. He looked at her profile. The composed face, the slight tension around her eyes that he'd noticed on the aircraft, and that was still there. The permanent residue of someone who had almost lost something significant and was still processing the closeness of it. I'll take the advisory role, he said, part-time. I need flexibility. For Lily. For Lily, he confirmed. She nodded, and then she said something that clearly cost her something to say, in the way that things said without a script cost people who are accustomed to scripts. I keep thinking about that morning. The tarmac, the way you just walked away. No argument, no appeal, nothing, just picked up the backpack and walked. He didn't say anything. I've been trying to figure out what I would have done, she said. In that position. And I think I would have argued. I would have made a case. She paused. Why didn't you? Nathan thought about it for a moment. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because he wanted to give her the real one. Because I've spent a long time knowing things that other people have decided not to believe, he said. And I've learned that the arguing isn't what changes it. The arguing just makes you bitter, and it makes them defensive, and then nobody learns anything. He paused. I figured if I was wrong about the situation, arguing would have made it worse. And if I was right, the situation itself would make the argument for me. He looked at the window. The aircraft made the argument. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Yes, it did. He took the elevator down alone, crossed the lobby, and walked out into the San Francisco afternoon, which was doing the thing it did in late afternoon. The fog starting to move in off the bay, the light going soft and sideways, the temperature dropping in that particular way that tourists always found surprising and locals had long since incorporated into how they dressed. He stood on the sidewalk outside the building for a moment, his jacket collar straight because Lily had told him to fix it, and looked at the sky above the bay where the fog was coming in like something patient and deliberate, and thought about nothing urgent for what felt like the first time in a long time. His phone buzzed, a text from Lily. How did it go? He looked at it for a moment, then typed back, Good. How was school? Okay, there are pancakes left from breakfast, Rosa said. I'll be home by 6. Okay, fix the collar thing. It looks weird in photos. He looked down at his collar, which he had fixed that morning and which was still fine, and put the phone in his pocket and started walking toward the parking structure. Above the bay, the fog continued its patient advance, turning the light, the specific quality of late afternoon, in a city that sits between water and hills. Golden at the edges, gray in the depth, the kind of light that doesn't ask you to feel anything particular about it, but tends to produce feelings regardless. Nathan walked through it with his hands in his jacket pockets and his shoulders slightly less tight than they'd been that morning, carrying exactly what he'd carried in, and nothing additional, which was not nothing. It was, in fact, quite a lot. The settlement took 11 weeks to finalize. Nathan had been warned by Bryce that it would take longer, that corporate legal processes involving intellectual property, federal investigation timelines, and a board in the middle of restructuring tended to move at the speed of institutions, which was to say slowly and with frequent pauses to consult additional parties about things that seemed like they should already have been decided. Nathan accepted this with the patience of a man who had learned, over years of working in environments where cutting corners produced catastrophic results, that some processes needed to move at the speed they needed to move, and rushing them created different problems than the ones you were trying to solve. He kept busy. The recertification consulting work with Deb had started the week after the board meeting, initially as an informal arrangement, phone calls in the evenings, a shared document folder where she posted technical questions, and he answered them with the specificity that the documentation alone couldn't provide. Deb was, as Warren had promised, very good. She asked questions that went directly to the structural logic of decisions Nathan had made 15 years ago, and she asked them without the particular defensiveness that engineers sometimes brought to inherited systems. The territorial reluctance to admit that the person who built the thing understood it differently than the people who'd been running it. She just wanted to know what he'd been thinking. He told her. By the third week, she was sending him draft recertification specifications. By the fifth week, she was calling him instead of emailing because the questions had gotten complex enough that written exchanges were too slow. By the seventh week, Warren had made the consulting arrangement official with a contract that Nathan's own lawyer, a compact, no-nonsense woman named Adriana, whom Rosa had recommended, reviewed and revised, and ultimately approved with the assessment that it was reasonable given the circumstances, and that Nathan should feel free to push for more in the next negotiation cycle. He didn't particularly, but he kept Adriana's opinion filed for future reference. Through all of this, Lily recovered. She recovered in the way children recover from significant things, not linearly, not without setbacks, but with a fundamental resilience that seemed to operate below the level of her conscious effort, as though her body had decided the business of healing was too important to leave to her opinions about it. There were 2 weeks of real fatigue, the kind that made her quiet and unlike herself, and Nathan found those weeks harder than the acute crisis of the surgery, because the acute crisis had adrenaline to carry it, and the recovery weeks had only patience, which was a thinner fuel. He drove her to school and picked her up and made dinner and sat with her while she did homework at the kitchen table and watched her get a little more like herself each day, incrementally. The way light comes back after a long winter. Not all at once, but in accumulation. Each day slightly longer than the last, until one day you realize the darkness has retreated without you being able to identify the exact moment it happened. The exact moment, in Lily's case, was a Thursday evening 5 weeks after surgery when she beat him at chess for the first time in 2 years. Not because he let her. He had tried to stop doing that when she was 6 and told him flatly that she could tell when he was letting her win, and she didn't want him to because it meant the win wasn't real. She beat him because she'd been thinking 3 moves ahead, and he'd been thinking about the recertification timeline, and she'd taken his queen with a pawn maneuver that he genuinely hadn't seen coming. She sat back in her chair with the specific expression of someone who had been waiting for this particular moment and found the reality of it satisfactory. "I've been practicing," she said. "When?" "Lunch. There's a chess club." He looked at the board, then at her. "Since when?" "Since October." She picked up his captured queen and turned it between her fingers. "You should pay more attention." He had laughed then, an actual laugh. Not the polite kind or the exhausted kind, but the kind that comes from somewhere unguarded. And it had surprised him slightly, the way genuine laughter sometimes surprises people who have been operating in serious mode long enough that they've forgotten what the other thing feels like. The 4-week follow-up with Dr. Reyes produced the imaging results they'd been waiting for. The repair was holding exactly as hoped. Lily's heart, the small, complicated organ that had been the central organizing fact of their lives for 5 years, was doing the thing it was supposed to do with a consistency that the imaging data described in clinical language and that Nathan translated internally into something simpler and more essential. It was working. She was going to be okay. Not in the qualified, monitored, provisional sense of the previous 5 years, but in the way that people are okay when the thing that was wrong has been fixed and the body has accepted the fix and moved on. Dr. Reyes delivered this in her careful clinical language and then paused and said, "I want to see her again at 6 months, and then annually after that for the next 5 years, just to maintain the record. But Nathan, I think we're done with the acute management phase. I think she gets to just be a kid now." He shook Dr. Reyes's hand and walked to the parking lot and sat in his car for about 4 minutes before starting the engine. 3 weeks after that, the settlement was finalized. He signed the documents at Adriana's office on a Tuesday morning while Lily was in school. The terms were comprehensive, a licensing arrangement that recognized his original authorship and provided ongoing royalties for every Guardian system installation across the Sterling fleet, a formal legal transfer of co-development rights for any future versions built on the original architecture, a full restoration of his engineering credentials through a separate agreement with the relevant certification bodies, which Torres's federal investigation had facilitated by producing documentation that cleared the record of the incident report that had attributed the near miss to his original design. That last piece had taken the longest, moving through regulatory channels at the pace Bryce had predicted, and it was in some ways the piece that mattered most to Nathan on a level that the financial settlement didn't touch. His name had been used to explain a failure caused by changes made to his work without his consent. The correction of that, the formal, documented, regulatory correction, was not something he could quantify or put on a balance sheet. It was something else. The restoration of a specific truth to the record. The difference between a history that said one thing and a history that said what actually happened. Adriana slid the final signature page across the desk and handed him a pen. He looked at the page for a moment before signing it. Not from hesitation, from the particular quality of attention that comes when you are aware that a moment is significant and you want to be actually present in it rather than just physically occupying it. He signed his name, Nathan A. Drake. The same signature he had been putting on engineering documents since he was 23 years old, the same handwriting, slightly compressed when he was tired, more deliberate when he was being careful. The same name that had appeared in those archived project files, in the original commit logs, in the version history that no one had looked at for 7 years because no one had thought to look. "Congratulations," Adriana said. She was not an effusive person, and she didn't make it into more than it was. "Call me if anything comes up with the implementation." He drove from her office to Lily's school, where he had volunteered several weeks earlier for the parent-helper slot on a third-grade field trip to a small regional science museum. He arrived slightly late, found Lily's class in the transportation exhibit, and was immediately recruited by the teacher to help supervise a group of 8-year-olds who were very interested in a model airplane cockpit you could sit in and very uninterested in staying in an orderly line to take turns. He spent 40 minutes managing this situation with the particular negotiating skill of a man who had been dealing with one very specific 8-year-old for 8 years and had developed transferable competencies. At one point, Lily appeared at his elbow and looked up at the cockpit display and said, "Is that what yours looked like?" "Roughly," he said. "Was it scary? When the screens went dark?" He thought about it honestly. "A little. Mostly, I was just focused on fixing it." She looked at the display for a moment. "What does the system actually do? Like, in regular words?" He crouched down beside her so they were at the same level, the way he'd always talked to her about things that mattered. Not talking down, just at the same altitude. "It makes sure the pilots are always in charge," he said. "No matter what the computer wants to do, the pilots can stop it. That's the whole thing. That's what it was built for." She considered this. That sounds simple. It is simple. Most of the important things are. She looked at him sideways, the way she looked at him when she thought he was being philosophical beyond what the situation required. "Can we get lunch after this?" "Yes." "Not oatmeal." "Definitely not oatmeal." She went back to the cockpit display and waited her turn in the line, and Nathan stood beside the exhibit and watched the children take turns sitting in the pilot's seat and gripping the controls with the unself-conscious seriousness of people inhabiting an idea, and he thought about what she'd said. That sounds simple. He had spent years of meetings and arguments and documentation and late nights and ultimately his career defending something that was, in its essence, not complicated. The pilot decides, not the software, not the executive who wanted to reduce departure delays, not the contractor brought in to modify a safety system without understanding what made it safe. The person in the seat, with their hands on the controls, who could see what was happening and could make the call. He had lost a great deal defending that. And he had, it turned out, also saved a great deal with it. Those two facts existed simultaneously, without canceling each other out, and he had come to think that was probably the honest shape of most things worth fighting for. The federal proceedings against Marcus Hale and the 2 board members moved forward through the spring. Nathan was not centrally involved. His role was limited to the technical testimony he'd already provided and 2 written statements that Torres requested about the device and the system architecture. And he followed the developments in the way you follow things that concern you but are no longer in your hands, with periodic attention and without the kind of daily investment that would have required him to reorganize his life around an outcome he couldn't control. What the proceedings established, over time, was a picture of something that had been building for longer than anyone outside of it had known. Hale had been positioning himself for an internal takeover of Sterling Aviation for nearly 2 years, cultivating the 2 board members through a combination of shared financial interests and what the federal filings described as a systematic misrepresentation of Victoria's leadership decisions, presenting routine strategic choices as evidence of instability or poor judgment, constructing a slow-motion narrative that would justify the leadership review he'd planned to trigger. The acquisition sabotage had been the culmination, not the beginning. The device in the avionics bay had been the mechanism. RVK-4, the private strip 60 miles from San Francisco, was owned through a holding company that traced back to an investment vehicle in which Hale held a controlling interest. He had planned it carefully, and he had executed it almost perfectly, and he had failed because of a security architecture he didn't fully understand, built by a man he had looked through on an aircraft as though he weren't worth looking at. Nathan didn't take particular satisfaction in this. He understood the temptation. There was a version of him that had every reason to find something gratifying in it, the specific satisfaction of the person proven right after years of being treated as wrong. But satisfaction in someone else's ruin had never been a fuel source he trusted, and he found he didn't need it. He had what he'd actually wanted, which was the truth in the record and his name on the thing he'd built. Everything else was legal process. Important, but not his. Victoria Sterling underwent what the business press, which followed her with the particular attention reserved for young executives who had become briefly dramatic, described as a significant leadership evolution. Nathan read some of this coverage and found it mostly accurate in its facts and mostly wrong in its framing, which was typical. The press wanted a transformation narrative, the cold CEO humbled and changed. The reality was less clean and more interesting than that. Victoria was not cold, had not been cold even on the morning she'd told him to get off her aircraft. She had been operating according to a set of assumptions she'd never examined because they had never cost her anything until that morning. What changed afterward was not her character but her awareness of her assumptions, which is a different and in some ways more durable kind of change. He saw her in person several times over the following months. Recertification meetings, the formal board session where the public authorship recognition was ratified, once for coffee in San Francisco, when she was in the city for a regulatory review, and texted him with the directness that was apparently just how she communicated with people she'd stopped performing for. She was, he found, considerably easier to be around once she'd decided to be honest about what she didn't know. She asked questions she would previously have felt she couldn't ask because they revealed gaps, and she listened to the answers without the overlay of someone processing information for its strategic value. She was still sharp, still demanding, still the kind of person who moved through a room at a speed that required other people to pay attention. She had just stopped mistaking the speed for the point. At the coffee meeting, she asked him, without particular preamble, how he thought about what had happened. Not the events, she was specific about that, but what he made of it, as a person. He thought about it for a moment. He was on his second coffee, which he shouldn't have been because it made it harder to sleep, and the afternoon was doing the fog thing again out the window. And he was thinking about a drive he needed to make to pick up Lily from soccer practice, which had been cleared by Dr. Reyes 2 weeks ago, and which Lily had approached with the focused intensity of someone who had been waiting for it since October. "I think I spent a long time being angry," he said. "And I think the anger was reasonable. What they did was wrong, and I knew it was wrong. And being right about something wrong that's happening to you and being unable to stop it, that's a specific kind of miserable." He paused. "But I think I made the anger do too much work. I used it as a reason to not try things, to stay small, to decide the world worked a certain way, and I wasn't going to fight it." He looked at his coffee. "Lily is a better reason than anger." Victoria turned her cup on the table, a small, thoughtful rotation. "Do you regret how long it took for the truth to come out?" "I don't know how to answer that honestly without it sounding either noble or bitter, and I don't think I'm either." He looked at her. "I wish it had happened differently. I wish I'd found a way to fight it at the time. But I was 26 and scared, and I had a 2-year-old, and I made the choices I made, and some of them were wrong, and some of them I had to make." He paused. "The thing I don't regret is the system itself. I built it right. They changed it, and the changed version caused problems. And the original version sat there in the code for 7 years and waited, and then on a Tuesday morning at 6 a.m., it did exactly what I designed it to do." He looked out the window. "That's not nothing." "No," Victoria said quietly. "It really isn't." The recertification of the Sterling fleet was completed over 7 months, a process that was slower and more expensive than Warren had originally estimated, which was typical of recertification projects, and which Nathan had told him would be typical when he asked for the original timeline. Every aircraft in the fleet running Guardian version 4 or later was brought into compliance with the original architecture. The pilot authority, hard lock, was reinstated. The departure authentication sequence was restored. The technical manuals were updated to reflect the original design intent, with Nathan's name in the authorship section of every document. Deb ran the project with the meticulous, slightly exhausted competence of someone who had taken on something larger than she'd originally scoped and was too invested in doing it correctly to complain much about the scope. Nathan consulted throughout, showing up to the hangars when in-person review was useful and calling in when it wasn't, maintaining the part-time structure that let him be in Portland for Lily's school schedule and her soccer games and the periodic follow-up appointments with Dr. Reyes that were now routine in the way that monitoring is routine. Present, but not threatening. He drove down to San Francisco 4 times during the recertification period for specific milestone reviews. Each time he walked through the hangar and looked at the aircraft and checked the work. He felt something he didn't try to name precisely. It was close to the feeling of returning somewhere you'd built with your own hands and finding it standing. Not pride exactly, more the verification of something you'd once believed and had been told was wrong and now had the evidence to look at. The Guardian flight system, designed by Nathan Drake, was in the air again. The original version, the one he'd actually built, doing what he'd actually intended it to do. On a Saturday in early October, 10.5 months after the morning at Portland International, Nathan and Lily flew to San Francisco on the Sterling Aviation Meridian G7. Not for any specific business purpose. Victoria had offered the aircraft for what she called, without elaboration, a familiarization flight. An opportunity for Lily to see the aircraft she had heard about in installments since August, starting with the post-oatmeal version that Nathan had told her in the hospital, and continuing through various subsequent editions as events developed. Lily had been very interested in the aircraft in the specific way she was interested in things she had not yet seen with her own eyes, which was to say she had approximately 14 questions ready before they left the house. They drove to Portland Executive Aviation in the early morning, which was clear and cold with the specific bright quality of October in the Pacific Northwest, the air so clean it almost had a taste to it. Lily was wearing a down jacket and her good sneakers and carrying her school backpack, which had her journal in it because she had decided several months ago that she was writing things down as they happened, on the basis that interesting things were more interesting when you had a record of them. Captain Graves was at the aircraft when they arrived. Nathan had spoken with him twice since the original flight, once to provide documentation for the federal investigation, once in a brief call that was ostensibly about recertification, but was mostly two professionals comparing notes on what they'd each taken from an unusual morning. Graves was the kind of pilot who did not give compliments casually and who received them the same way, and the conversation had had the quality of two people acknowledging something significant without making it bigger than it needed to be. Now Graves looked at Lily with the slightly formal attention that certain men of his generation gave to children, the attention that was trying to decide how to calibrate itself, and Lily looked back at him with her direct dark eyes and said, "Are you the captain?" "I am," Graves said. "My dad fixed your plane." Graves glanced at Nathan, something flickering briefly in his expression that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. "He did," he said. "Can I see the cockpit?" "Lily," Nathan said. "That's a reasonable question," Graves said. He looked at her. "Come on, then." She followed him up the stairs with the focused forward momentum of a person who had been waiting for something and was now doing it, and Nathan came up behind her and stepped into the aircraft that he had last boarded 10.5 months ago under circumstances that had been, by any measure, more eventful than this morning promised to be. The cabin was the same seats, the same oval windows, the same arrangement of everything that he had registered on that first boarding with the automatic professional inventory of someone whose brain categorized aircraft environments the way other people categorized furniture. It looked the same, and it also looked different, in the way that places look different after something significant has happened in them. Not physically changed, just carrying a different weight in your knowledge of them. Chen was in the cockpit. She turned in the left seat when they came through the door, and she looked at Lily with the particular expression that certain people reserve for children who appear in contexts they're surprised by, and Lily looked at the cockpit displays with an attention so concentrated it was almost physical. "These are the screens that went dark," Lily said. Not a question. "They were," Chen said, "and now they work." They do. Lily looked at them for a long moment. What does that one do? She pointed at the navigation display. Chen spent 10 minutes explaining the cockpit to an 8-year-old with the patient professionalism of someone who took the question seriously, which Nathan observed and appreciated. Lily asked follow-up questions that were, for an 8-year-old, fairly specific, which Nathan attributed to the amount of time she had spent listening to him describe aircraft systems over the past several months, and which Chen seemed to find genuinely interesting rather than something to be managed. At one point, Lily looked up at Nathan in the doorway and said, "Does it have your code in it now?" "My original code," he said. "Yes." "The one that made it stop?" "The one that made it stop." She turned back to the displays, processing this. "So it has your name in it, inside." Effectively. She seemed to find this satisfactory. She looked at Chen. "Is that the throttle?" Chen looked at Nathan. Nathan shrugged slightly, in the manner of a man who had learned that some forces were better accepted than redirected. Chen turned back to Lily and said, "It is. Do you want to hear what it does?" They took off at 9:40, the engines the same whisper-quiet Nathan had registered on the original flight, the acceleration the same steady press of physics and engineering working in their designed relationship. Lily had the window seat. She watched the ground fall away with an expression that Nathan recognized because he'd been watching it since she was very small. The look she got when encountering something that exceeded what she'd imagined it would be. The collision of expectation and reality producing a stillness that was different from her usual focused engagement, something closer to pure receiving. She didn't say anything for about 3 minutes after Wheels Up, just watched. Then she said, without looking away from the window, "It's different from regular planes." "Smaller," Nathan said. "No, I mean," she searched for the word, "quieter. Like it's not trying as hard." He looked at her profile against the window. "That's actually a good way to describe good engineering," he said. She turned to look at him. "Really? When something is designed well, it doesn't fight itself. All the parts do what they're supposed to do, and there's no wasted effort. It gets quieter, the better it works." She considered this with the seriousness she gave to things she intended to retain. Then she said, "Like how you talk about it. You don't get loud about it." He wasn't sure what to say to that, so he looked out the window at the coast coming into view below them, the line where the water met the land that always looked, from altitude, like a boundary between two different ideas about the world. "Is that why they thought they could take it from you?" she asked. "Because you weren't loud?" It was the kind of question that a child asks without knowing they've walked directly into the middle of something significant, and which adults receive with the strange sensation of being found out. Nathan looked at his daughter, who was 8 years old and had a cardiac repair that was holding and a chess game she had been practicing at lunch, and a journal she was filling with records of things that seemed important to her, and he thought about how to answer honestly without it being more than she needed right now. "Partly," he said, "and partly because they thought the thing they were taking wasn't mine to begin with, that the work belonged to the company, and I just worked there." "But it was yours." "It was mine," he said, "because you made it." "Because I made it." She turned back to the window. He watched her think, the small visible working of an 8-year-old integrating information into a framework that was still being built. "So what do?" she said slowly, "when someone takes something that's yours but says it isn't?" He thought about the tarmac at Portland International in the dark before sunrise. He thought about a box of personal items in a parking lot 8 years ago. He thought about 6 years of contract maintenance work and the apartment with the narrow kitchen and the cold coffee at 4 in the morning. "You keep the part of it that lives in you," he said, "the understanding, the knowing how it works. No one can take that because they can't get to it." He paused. "And then you wait for the situation that proves it." She was quiet for a moment, then, "That sounds really hard." "It was," he said. "But you did it." "I did it." He looked at her. "Mostly because of you, for the last 8 years. So there's some credit that goes to your account." She made the face she made when she was pleased but was calibrating how much to show it. "You should probably not tell me that too often," she said. "It'll go to my head." He laughed. She let herself smile. Outside, California moved below them in the morning light. The coast and the hills and the bay coming into view, the same view he'd seen 10.5 months ago from a different angle, under different weight. The city looked the same from here, Cities always did. The things that changed in them were too small to see from altitude. A man signing a document at a lawyer's desk, a child sleeping in a hospital bed, a line of code in an avionics system restored to what it was supposed to say. When they landed at San Francisco Executive Airfield, Graves taxied to the same private apron where Nathan had stood on that original morning, holding a child's backpack, watching his own creation lock down a jet that had tried to leave without his permission. He hadn't known, standing there, what any of it would lead to. He'd known only that the aircraft was doing what he'd built it to do, and that Lily needed him in San Francisco, and that the next step was to climb the stairs he'd just walked down. That had been enough. The next step always was. The cabin crew, 2 flight attendants who had not been on the original flight but who knew the story, as everyone at Sterling Aviation knew the story by now, both said good morning to Nathan by name as he and Lily prepared to disembark, with the specific warmth of people who meant it rather than the professional warmth of people performing it. Lily noticed this and filed it away in the visible manner she filed things she intended to think about later. Graves came back through the cabin before they got off. "Good flight," he said to Nathan. "Good flight," Nathan agreed. Graves looked at Lily. "Your father's code is in every checklist procedure we run now," he said. "Every pre-departure sequence. Pilot authority verification, architect authentication, the full original architecture." He said it simply, to her, not as a speech but as a fact he thought she should know. "Every time we run those procedures, his name's in the manual." Lily looked at her father, then back at Graves. "Does it work better?" she asked. "Yes," Graves said. "It does." She nodded, with the satisfied finality of someone checking something off a list she'd been maintaining. Then she picked up her backpack, the school one, with the journal, and headed for the aircraft stairs. Nathan paused at the top of the stairs. He wasn't sure why. There was no reason to pause there, no ceremony required, nothing left unfinished. He just stopped for a moment at the top of the stairs of this aircraft, this particular aircraft, and looked back into the cabin at the seats and the oval windows and the closed cockpit door, the physical fact of the place where most of it had happened, and he acknowledged it in the simple private way that people acknowledge things that have mattered to them and that they don't need to say out loud. Then he went down the stairs, into the October morning, where Lily was already at the bottom looking up at him with the impatience of someone who had plans. "There's a place with actual good pancakes near the hospital," she said. "Rosa told me. We should go." "We just had breakfast." "That was 3 hours ago. That's basically lunch." He reached the bottom of the stairs. She was already walking toward the car. Victoria's assistant had arranged, backpack bouncing, sneakers on the pavement, making the small decisive sounds of a person who knows where she's going. He followed her. Some things did not need to be more than they were. A father and his daughter walking across a tarmac in the morning light, heading toward pancakes, the aircraft behind them humming with the quiet of good engineering, systems working, pilots in control, everything exactly as designed. Nathan Drake had built something that lasted. He had lost it and then found it again, not whole, not without cost, but found it. The name in the record, the code in the system, the truth where it needed to be. He had also built something else, in the 8 years between the losing and the finding, something that walked ahead of him now in a down jacket with a backpack and opinions about breakfast, and that had never been taken from him because no one had ever known to try. The October sky over San Francisco was enormous and clear, the kind of sky that makes no particular promises but holds a great deal of light, and underneath it the world went about its business with the patient ordinary motion of a world that does not stop for any single story but contains all of them, all at once, without effort. And Nathan Drake walked across the tarmac in the morning and did not look back.